Productions, Praxis Pedagogy exists to position our teaching and learning practice within different methodologies. We want to construct a guild of educators dedicated to designing a difference in our own teaching and learning and in our students' experience. Everybody, welcome back to this episode 69 of Praxis Pedagogy Podcast, where we are looking into the book Appreciative Inquiry in Higher Education by Jeannie Cockwell and Joan MacArthur Blair. We are doing chapter 4, which is entitled Critical Appreciative Inquiry. And in this chapter, we explore 4 ideas through the lens of critical appreciative inquiry, the inclusive practitioner, the shift from a focus on issues to a focus on inquiry, topic development, and emergent design. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you on the other side. Take care. Hey everybody, welcome back to Praxis Pedagogy Podcast, where we like to center our pedagogy and praxis to help us become better educators in what we're doing. And we are in chapter 4, but you already knew that because you would have saw the title on the title card. And we are in Appreciative Inquiry in Higher Education, a transformative force, ladies. Mm-hmm. Chapter 4, Critical Appreciative Inquiry. You knew this chapter was coming. It just had to be here. And, man, it was a doozy. I think it's the biggest chapter yet. Yeah. Possibly one of the heaviest chapters yet. What'd you think? Overall thoughts?
Yeah, it's good. It's very, very powerful. Yeah. It leads, I think the book so far has led you into this approach, and you start seeing the opportunities that lie within this appreciative inquiry approach. And then right here in chapter 4, it tells you why this is so important. Yeah. Like if you were hovering on the importance of this is a way, I think, to, confront the dominant order, and through self-reflection as well, maybe, confronting yourself with that too. But yes, super powerful. If anybody got this far in the book and was thinking, oh yeah, I think I've grasped this, I'm good, 3 chapters, then suddenly you go in for a deep dive here, down into what really matters.
Yep.
Yeah, I agree. Like if you thought that appreciative inquiries was rainbows and butterflies and magic wands, then, especially when people, we have had this discussion, is you obviously want a positive outcome to when you're working through different things. And this is when it gets complex, when it gets nitty and gritty, when you have to, it says, in that first piece, the impact of difference and power and diversity and how you manage it. And I also like that this chapter was full of kind of structure and examples, and it could even give you that introduction to start planning your own process. So I did leave with a few questions to just how we could maybe discuss it as well within our own like bubble of the institutions that we work in. But yeah, it was difficult. It's one I'm going to have to read a few times over and break it up a bit, just so that I can think about how maybe I can utilize this well in practice in what I do in my job. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it was very, very good. Very good chapter. What do you think, Tim?
Yeah, I thought it was a good chapter. Obviously, haven't been disappointed with any of the chapters, quite honestly. And this chapter does not disappoint. It brings the heat. It brings some fire. And as a white guy in higher ed.
Yeah.
Yep. Just add this to the pile of books that I got to read. But All in all, there was a good amount of information in here that I'm thinking to myself, okay, I'm kind of already doing some of this just with a different lens, right? Like I'm not looking at my AI specifically as a tool to make wide sweeping social change. In my context, I'm using AI to make sweeping change in TVET. And there are just different aspects to that, and we'll probably touch on those as we go. I did like the diagram on page 65, figure 4.1, the critical appreciative inquiry, and how it's really a culmination of three things: the social construction, the appreciative inquiry, and the critical theory. And it was good for me to read all that. And I like the kind of the last paragraph before we get into the four key areas where it's written there for us that it provides a framework for people to construct stories that have common themes and future images, right? And in doing that, it helps us facilitate the process. And it's kind of what I've said before in a few other chapters. So I don't want to repeat myself too much, but I really appreciated the emergent piece that was allowed to happen within this chapter. It felt a little focused at first, and I thought, where's the emergency in all of this? Where are you allowing it to be emergent? Because one word floated to the top for me time and time again, and that was intentionality. Right, the intentionality that this chapter challenges you to bring to the process. So, yeah, good chapter for me.
Yeah, I kind of like in that first piece when you're talking about, dominant cultures and that, social constructions and based on different backgrounds. And one of my looking at this kind of piece, I was like, how could you do this well in the world that we work in? Like, so within our institutions, when you are putting together like a committee of people to decide upon something or to create something, normally you don't get the opportunity to specifically choose the type of people that you want, to be on that committee. So it talks about bringing on page 111, it talks about bringing people from different purposes to level that transformation. So first of all, like when you look at a purpose that you're going into, you've got to obviously break that down into layers as well, because you're going to be transforming in the ways of coming up with ideas, but you're also going to be micro transforming people's individual ideas that they bring to the table. So you're managing all these different complexities, which I found really great and worrying and exciting at the same time. But also, if you are choosing a group of people, a diverse group of people, how can we do that in our institutions? How can we really be, that prescriptive when we have our stakeholders like, different unions, or they've sent us somebody and this union sent us somebody, and then administration sent us somebody and faculty has sent us somebody, and we need to work through this. How could we do that within our microculture? So that's where I feel like I need to, it can't just be a few of us in an institution that look at this lens. It has to really be a big part of the institution to understand this critical appreciative inquiry, to understand how we can actually make sure that these different diverse areas of the college are being heard. So yeah, it was, as I said, like it threw out a lot of questions as well as like planning.
Yeah, and I would question as well, how diverse can a committee be in a higher educational institution when we think about those that have already been excluded from that setting? So, recognizing the privilege that we already hold, Tim, you mentioned that already. And of course, Lucy and I don't have one of those privileges. We're not male. Yep. And so, straight away, we know that exists around there. But I'm thinking about, as you're saying, Lucy, with our committees, looking for that diversity and the representation of those that have been excluded, and how can we find them in post-secondary institutions when those those barriers, those social structures have already excluded them from such workplaces. And I know that we're doing better, and I'm really excited that we're doing better, and that there's higher ed's been very intentional about that, but it's just the beginning of what's probably a very long journey. And so I think, in the short term, I wonder, begins to, the question for me is, how do we bring outside voices that exist outside, the ivory towers as such?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. And I found myself, I don't know if it was more, I found myself looking at this at a more meta level than I probably needed to. Because we've banged on this topic quite a bit too, but I found myself like in the margins writing notes like the bias of vocation, example, academic and trades. Mm-hmm. Right. And as hard as the three of us have worked to try and break down some of those silo walls, in some places it's worked and in some places it hasn't worked. And so that's kind of the perspective that began to emerge for me more and more as I read through the chapter. Right. And it became salient for me. And when I came into this paragraph in that first section of the inclusive AI practitioner, where the authors state that our intention here is not to discuss all the aspects of difference, power, privilege, and diversity, but to nudge practitioners to begin a journey to deeply understand these aspects that influence the AI process. And here's the key for me, how they themselves are showing up in the process and the biases they are bringing with them. Mm-hmm. Right. And so you're right. We may not always get to pick the people that are on the team. Right. We're just given a team and we're told, okay, get the job done. So now, this is where I see our role as AI practitioners really coming to fruition and saying, okay, if we can't pick the team, then it's incumbent upon us to start modeling the way and really begin to model that process of inclusionary practice and leaving biases as much as we can at the door when we walk in. Because if we're doing that, this is my experience. If I feel like I'm doing that, then I feel better about the outcome. And I actually feel less need to control the outcome, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I mean, Silence. Oh my God. I just thinking about like, how would you even navigate like that kind of, because, if you can't pick, but then you want, I guess it's one of the most important stages of this. And they talk about that later on in the chapter about, looking at your agenda and stuff, but like really focusing on like who are the people that are in the room, what are their experiences, what can they bring to their team, where they feel, there are weaknesses, and, as an individual, as a group, like what, as us individually, we've never really been asked to do that before, ever. I mean, I've never come into a meeting and being asked to like, look at my diversity and my experience and what I can bring to the team, or bring to this committee, and it starts to come out maybe, but if you're making it an intentional piece of the process, that's really out there in higher ed. It really is.
Mm. And I think on that note as well, Lucy, the coming to the committees and then looking around and saying whose voice is not being represented here, whose voice is not at this table, and that's the piece of the puzzle that we're actually looking for. And I think that becomes challenging within our institutions, because there's typically I know many of the committees that I sit on, there'll be one representative from trades, and we spoke a little bit about this last week, actually, when, in the podcast before Cascade idea. We spoke about this very briefly about the whole thing of categorizing trades instructors as they're all trades instructors. Trades instructors think like this. Well, of course, if we cannot ground that statement in social constructivism, or if we try to, we very quickly go, okay, that's not possible. So why do we say that? And so I think that's the piece, isn't it? That if you have a representative from trades within your institution, then being mindful that this is my perspective. How can it represent, the other 70 instructors within that same institution? I mean, I'm not sure I have the answer. Well, I definitely know I don't have the answers here, but it seems to me that there's lots of questions, around this whole piece of being, inclusivity.
So do you resonate with the bridge metaphor that they mention quite a bit in this chapter?
Oh, Tim Carson, you're just leaving us hanging on that one, aren't you?
And silence again.
Yes.
So the first time that they mention it, that I've circled in here, they may have mentioned it once before, but is in that second section on moving from issue focus to inquiry focus.
Right.
Which is something that I think all of us in this podcast try to do a lot, is we try to get people to focus away from the issue and focus into why are we doing it? Where are we going? What's good about what we're doing? What can iterate better? I've mentioned before that sometimes there's a space for people to just vent, right? And just let them go and express their emotions. Because like I said, you don't always get to pick the people who are on the team. Like, I'll give you an example. I show up to an articulation meeting. I don't get to pick the people who are there at the articulation meeting, but they've asked me to come and facilitate a process. So I'll come and facilitate a process. I don't know anybody's background. I don't know experience that they have with third party, governing bodies or certification pieces or exams. I have no clue. But I'll sure find out that there's something under the surface pretty quickly. Right. And so this statement that they make is that between these two spaces, which they refer back in the previous paragraph, they say that AI practitioners must build a bridge in order for individuals who feel that they have historically been discriminated against in the academy to fully engage in the AI process. So let me switch some of those words around because we may not run into this specifically. But it made me think of, AI practitioners must build a bridge in order for individuals who feel that they've been historically mistreated by third party, by administration, to help them fully engage in the process. And then once I started thinking along those lines, I'm like, bingo, there's trades and academia again, or there's trades and the third party process. There's even trades faculty who have been doing this for 20 years, and there are trades faculty who've been doing this for 20 minutes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And it does. Yeah. Oh, sorry, Lucy, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say too, I mean, I've noticed a slight shift in, having trades programs being underrepresented, having trades people in senior areas of the college being, fully underrepresented. And again, it's all due to, what we were talking about, like, feeling under, feeling not, I can't possibly be part of this conversation because, I didn't do the traditional route of academia, or being a woman in trades in senior leadership. Like it definitely I don't know what it is, but you sit in this room and you feel like I have to defend myself. I have to prove that I'm allowed this seat at this table. And so, I just find that it is maybe getting better in my micro, maybe because I live in Vancouver and it's a little bit more, forward thinking in how we look at, I say that our institution is just building its EDI kind of profile mandate platform right now. So when we're looking at other colleges that, throughout Canada that, may have not even started this conversation yet, and how do we articulate this same message throughout all post-secondary so this culture and this stigma isn't there?
And exclusion's so interesting. I know what really resonated with me as I was reading through this about one of the team had written together a blurb that they were sending out to the participants, and somebody drew it to one of the facilitators' attention that the language that they'd used was not appropriate to their particular audience, and therefore it was going to exclude people. So through that choice of language that's used. And it reminded me of when I first started my PhD, and it seemed like an enormous enormous leap going from a master's into this PhD program, especially when I found myself that the prof I had at that time would often speak in Latin. So, he would talk and say something, but then he'd summarize it with a Latin term, which the other 6, graduate students in the room obviously all knew what that Latin term was, because they had very traditional educational journeys. They had done their undergrad degree, they'd gone to do their master's, and here they were immersed in the ivory tower every day. So they had access to this. I had no access to it. I couldn't write it. It wasn't like I could write it down and then Google it, which is, I think many of us, when we're shifting into the world of academia, we do that. We have to find out, but you can't do that with Latin, because unless you actually have some understanding of Latin, you actually cannot spell what these words are. So it really excludes, and it was, and not only did it exclude me from the, gaining an understanding of really what was being discussed, but it reinforced that I didn't really have access to that classroom. Yeah. Like I had been allowed in, but now it was going to be it was on my shoulders if I was going to be successful, if I was going to be, because they weren't going to make it easy for me. And it's pretty obvious, somebody that has been a hairdresser, started a hairdressing apprenticeship at the age of 16 and carried on in that profession, and then gone into the post-secondary education as a hairdressing instructor, even though and then they've gone through their masters. It's pretty obvious that, or let's take a guess, maybe it's not obvious at all, but if we were going to take a guess, would we think this person really had a sound understanding of Latin? I'm going to say we would probably know if we considered it. But I think that's the point. That's the point here, isn't it? How many of our actions exclude so many?
Mm-hmm. And I also find it's hard to talk about as well, because, sometimes when I feel like as a blonde, blue-eyed white girl, with an English accent, it's sometimes really hard for me to trigger up some of these conversations. And, it is hard. And when we're talking about looking at inclusive committees, and we're looking at, okay, we want, people that represent this group, we want to make sure that I've invited somebody with an Indigenous knowledge and background to share within this committee. I want to make someone from disability services to be in this committee, and everyone's marked off, but they don't really look at like the schools, because I hate it when there's a token person, and we've just mentioned something like that, like a token person on the committee, whether it's an Indigenous person, whether it's someone from disabilities, and I don't want to put us in the same box, and I'm absolutely not, but I'm saying too, like, we'll bring one tradesperson in as this token person and to lend a voice. And I feel that we are kind of moving from that, but that's what I feel like. I mean, even in the Center of Teaching, Learning and Research, we have one tradesperson and we have one person from nursing and so forth. But we have 3 people from academia, and then we have a nursing instructor that is, vocational, and then we have me. So I feel like I'm constantly like having to advocate. And so, not that I know what it is to be, in this diverse, and this stigma and for my entire life. But I understand that tokenism is just, something that we should avoid. So how do we even manage that? How do we, because it's hard that when you have one person from each that brings completely different experiences from different cultures, and now they have to be that diverse voice for that entire group of people. And it's very hard to put on one person to do that, whether it's something like being an Indigenous person or a deaf person or someone that's from a different school that's underrepresented. How do you put that pressure on that person to keep coming forward?
Especially as you're saying that they've been excluded anyway for whatever reason. And we're saying, we're drawing this divide, which we know exists between vocational and the academic vocational divide. We know it exists, and we've all been working actively to really, I think, sort of reposition it, like identify the strengths of both and acknowledge the strength of both. I mean, there was a conversation last week of, a tradesperson identifying as an academic. And, I thought about that a lot afterwards. And I don't know that we want to, as a tradesperson, I mean, having a PhD, I feel comfortable saying, yes, I can stand in that in that space and say I'm an academic. But as a tradesperson, do I really want to identify as an academic? I don't think so, because that dismisses the actual knowledge and the skills that I have. Like as a craftsperson, and I know, Tim, you've spoken a lot about this, in the past around craftsmanship. And if we identify as academics, we're chucking away one of our core real strengths that should be equally as valuable. So it's interesting how we identify. But just coming back round to that, Lucy, I totally agree with you to bring people in and have them having to put all this weight on their shoulders to have their voice heard, especially when they've been excluded for so long.
Yeah.
And I remember somebody saying a good few years ago around land acknowledgement, when we began to start our classes and our presentations with land acknowledgements, and an Indigenous person that I work with, she had said that she was getting endless communication now from faculty members saying, can you help me? Can you tell me what I need to do? And she said, it's not my responsibility. It's your responsibility. Like, we need to take responsibility. And I think this is, when we think around these, social structures around differences, it is our responsibility, isn't it, to seek, to better understand those differences and the discrimination that goes along with them.
Mm-hmm. And the boxes I'm just thinking, too, like in our world, like it's boxes all the time we're put into, like this is disabilities area, this is trades area, this is academic. Like maybe you need some tradespeople in the disabilities area and some disabilities people in the trades area. And you need some, Indigenous people in CTLR, people that represent that group in CTLR, in the trades. Like, you need to mix it up a bit. That's the only way we can be inclusive, is we let people into our clubs that, that we belong in, and let everybody in. So it's like, it's a big job, but it's fascinating, and I'm excited for it for sure. But,
yeah, I agree with both of you, and yet I find myself disagreeing with some of the stuff too, in the sense that, as a tradesperson, identifying as an academic, I find myself more and more going, you know what, I'm okay with the label faculty. I'm not sure I want to be labeled an academic, because, I spent a lot of time learning my trade, learning my craft. And then when I got into education, I still had a lot to learn. I still have a lot to learn. I'm by no means an expert in it. And maybe it's just a terminology thing for me, but I see this movement of, going from the micro to the macro, and maybe we should be just focusing in on a little bit bigger than micro. And here's why. Because Lucy, when you said, we should be taking people from trades and put them in the LTC, and take people from accessibility resources and throw them in, a nursing class, and mishmash all these people around. I agree with it. And yet I also find myself disagreeing with it. And I agree with it because I think there's a lot to be learned and a lot to be profited from by having this cross-pollination. I also think there's a lot to be said about laying our own pride down and inviting people in to be a part of the process, even though they're not part of the tribe. And, and maybe it's incumbent upon me to learn a little bit more about what it takes to be in the LTC, if for no other reason than to broaden my perspective on what they look at and how they process stuff. And that's one thing that I've valued a lot in a lot of these team environments and different organizations I've been able to work with, is that once I began to understand other people's perspectives, it really clarifies how I can engage in that process. And I find that if more people are doing that, it's actually easier to engage in the process, because I know where the boundaries are. I know where my limitations are, but I also know that there's some overlap. And if there's trust there, I know that if I fumble, somebody will be there to pick it up, and vice versa. And so, like I said, I find myself agreeing with a lot of stuff that's being said, but I also find myself going, I'm not sure I'm ready to hang up my trades moniker to move over there just to prove to somebody that I can hang out with that crowd. Right. And maybe it's just because I'm getting old and caring less about that piece too. I don't know.
I think though, Tim, I think this is, exactly where I'm going with it. I think that, as tradespeople, we have been excluded from, micros. Like let's think about his work. He's written so well on the academic vocational divide, and also the the effects of it, what the consequences are of that divide, and and there's many that have written on it. So it's not just a chip on our shoulders. Like it really exists. But the more I know and the more I understand it, I too feel the same. I'm seeing it completely different. It's not that I'm excluded. It's what we are, what we know, and what we do, our skill as craftsmanship. We need to recognize and validate that. We don't need to be accepted. What we're doing is we're just raising the profile of that, and no more would we expect an academic to come over and say, I want you to consider me as a tradesperson. I want you to consider me as a craftsperson because I made, I made this little cabinet on the weekend. Yeah, that's great. That's very nice. And, I wrote one little article, but, this doesn't make us either or, but just recognizing it. And I think the piece that really resonates for me in this chapter is when, social justice work belongs to all of us. Yeah. And so it isn't, we can't, like Lucy was saying, having to, being given a place at the table and then feeling that you have to really, fight. You've got the place there, but now you have to fight to have your voice heard and things like that. But realizing that, no, that's not it. If everybody around the table does value that social justice is all, for all of us, it's not for those that hold the power to decide whether we can be heard. It's a different approach to that. At the same time, recognizing that we as individuals hold so much power, but it's easier for us to recognize where we're excluded. And I think that's, this is the great thing about this chapter. Just reading, there's one whole section in here, and just as a white female, and one of the first points they make in this chapter is knowing that whenever I pay with a credit card, that my credit will not be questioned just quite simply because I'm white. And then the second point, number 2, really, I thought was so powerful, where I can confidently wear secondhand clothing and call it, what's that name for second? Thank you. Call it vintage clothing, and it be extra stylish because of my color. And you read, the more we read, the more we inquire about this ourselves. I cannot help but think, like, I think, Lucy, you said earlier, are you going to have to read this chapter again a few more times? And I'm on my 3rd read of it today, and yet I know I'm going to return to it. And yeah.
I do like, though, in the chapter, like, it does give you those examples of how you would run an agenda, and some of the questions, like, it softly introduces you to starting to play around with this. So I love that, because I'm obviously from trade. So give me a procedure, I will follow it, and then I will adapt it once I've mastered it. And that's, pretty much what we do. But I'm just getting to my notes, but we it does say, like, in your first day, an agenda highlights from day one of their examples. And I feel that it just does, it just gives you that confidence to start the conversation and just let it flourish, just let it do its thing, and see what happens after you've gone around that room. Asking, I started working on this project because I believe the greatest hope for the future of my work is, I am deeply committed to these 2 days because, and I feel just from those 3 questions in a room of people, you can start to gather some themes if you facilitate that well, and give the whole room a bit of a picture of where the roots are starting from with this discussion or agenda item. So I really did like that help. That was.
Mm-hmm. And as we get further and further in, and I mean, I'm still, I think about my own facilitation style, and I just know that these 2 women, they have really, I mean, they've spent so much time with this. And I think about, just even in small group facilitation, how themes emerge that you never expected to emerge. But and obviously it's easy to start with that, your intended outcome there, and you hope that your discussions just bring people to that place. But if you're with this lens of diversity, we cannot really have, I mean, if we haven't lived those experiences and values of belief of so many different, social structures, there must be so many times when the facilitators, the authors of this book, have been totally surprised by the direction that this has gone in. And I mean, I would just so love to talk to them or to hear their stories. I mean, they do a wonderful job of sharing their stories. And I think what's so powerful here, the piece that you're just talking about, Lucy, when they start to explain what day 1 and what day 2 look like and the questions they ask, but also how they embedded it with artists and musicians that represent the values and the beliefs of the intended or the overarching goal of this 2-day. So even though the pathway isn't clear, but what the artist and the musician, the belief structures that they came with are totally the direction that you're going in. And so that's interesting as well, isn't it? How they've really shaped that, embedded it throughout, woven it throughout the whole 2 days.
Yeah, no, I also liked when they asked the questions like, tell us about your best experience, about a time when you've been using your influence, living and working with these issues. Like, it's all about the questions. And this is why, Tim, we were talking about this before we came on, but just how you can ask these questions and they're just so well done. And I think this is a great example of making sure that the planning that you go into, you ask questions in a way that will pull that information out. And in a very kind of, in a way that you're getting that raw information. It's not pre-planned. They're not coming in with items that they want to, completely spill out. It's going to be raw because it's the type of questions that you're creating. And
such an art to that. It's an art that I have, certainly that I just begin. I believe I'm only beginning the journey of mastering that. And like Tim, all credit to you. We were, like Lucy said, we were talking about this earlier, it's wonderful to work with somebody, alongside somebody that is able to structure questions in that way. But I believe it's all has to be always very intentional. And it's so easy to slip into asking a question that shapes the direction of the result, isn't it? And so, I mean, they've done that, but they've intentionally done it. Like, the question you just mentioned, Lucy, about how have you influenced, how is your influence, so really, like, using that term, you've got to reflect, but rather than saying, I want you to go through this reflective practice, their question is guided you right there. There's no way you can answer this question without digging deep and reflecting.
Absolutely. And I think as we begin closing this session of our series in this book, it's something that you just practice. You have to get practice at it, right? And nobody's born with the ability to ask really, really good, deep questions right from the beginning. It's always a progression. And much like our trade, right? Like, we weren't born, able to do what we do, but we had to learn it. And sometimes we learn by failing, and sometimes we learn by watching, and most times we learn by doing, which is a great moniker to have on our t-shirt, learn by doing.
And you know what, Tim? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, that's why I really love this book, because it provides you with some of those questions, and then you can really start to think about it. And I think my most favorite question, back to the magic wand and rainbows and hope, is the 3 wishes question. And I'm actually, that's what I'm going to implement like this week, is committees that I'm already working on that have already been formed, but we don't really know our direction yet or what the outcome is going to be. That's going to be the question of 3 wishes from using your influence in living and working with the issues that we have. What would they be? And I just think that will just show everybody like the direction and people's level of commitment and passion to this cause. So magic wands and 3 wishes.
You know what, Lucy, when you say that, what I hear is a faculty member, that would just be such a wonderful opportunity. That's what I hear there. So I think that's incredible.
Absolutely.
Tim, circling back to what you just said about nobody is born with the ability to ask these questions, I think that is the perfect way to bring this conversation to close. We started talking about this whole approach being grounded in social constructivism, and you've actually like really situated it in there as we close. Like, we are not born with any of this. Our biases, our beliefs, our values, everything are shaped by our histories, our cultural, our families, and go forth. And so when we consider that and we exclude those for their different experiences and cultures, I think it really is an awareness that is worth sharing.
Yeah, I agree. So if I was to boil this chapter down into one word, like I said, it would be intentional. Being intentional with the planning, with the questioning, even with our own thinking process, and taking the time to really investigate it. So thanks, everybody. It's been a pleasure, as always.
Yeah, it was great.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you
Seemed
so
so
much,
short today. We had so much to say.
I
will put a plug in, and hopefully if Jeannie and Joan are listening to this podcast, then we're going to reach out to you soon and ask you to come and be a part of
because
the
I'm sure
final.
they're listening and they want to respond to what we're saying. And I'm sure they're like speaking out loud in their living room. Like,
they're probably yelling at us in an appreciative kind of way. You just don't get it.
Yes.
Go back to chapter 1 and start again.
That's right. Oh, that Carson guy, he needs to read chapter 2 again. He just
Yeah, they're going to send us homework.
Perfect. All right. Thanks again.
Thank you.